All right, should be good to go. I'm gonna start screen sharing. All right, hi everyone, sorry about that. I was trying to broadcast and there was some technical difficulties. Just gonna wait for the screen to load up and we'll be good to go. All right, perfect. So I just want to start off by saying that this webinar is going to be recorded and uploaded to UCSD's Cross-Cultural Center's YouTube page. But with that being said, none of you all will be recorded. The only face that will be visible is my own. But just letting you all know, so in case you want to watch this later on. And also, I will be using, let me turn this on right now. I will be using Google Slide closed captioning. So please excuse if there are any words that are not exactly what I say. And this will be the start of my program. It's called Math as a Form of Civil Rights. And I'll talk more about what that means later because that title admittedly is a little unexpected, I would say. Whoops. Okay, so I want to start with the land acknowledgement. As UCSD sits on unsettled territory and traditional homelands of the Kumeyaay people, we as members of the UCSD community must acknowledge the land of the Kumeyaay people. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor the original people of this land. Thank you. And I still put the land acknowledgement in here because it's important to recognize that even though we're not necessarily on UCSD's campus right now and this program is not happening on at UCSD, the only reason the program is happening is because UCSD was founded on that territory. So, quick introductions. Hi, my name is James King. I am a third year transfer. So this is my third year at UCSD. I spent 2 years at Sacramento State College where I got my AA in mathematics. It's still kind of weird to think I have a degree, but that's, so yeah, it's still kind of weird. Right now, my major is applied mathematics with a minor in African American studies. This fall, I'll be attending San Diego State University to pursue my master's in mathematics and teaching services. And right now, I am a Cross-Cultural Center intern. And to be more precise, I'm one of the 4 social justice educator interns. Normally in my introductions, I would put more information, but I think my presentation has a lot of content, so just gonna skip most of it, or skip most of the intro that I would normally do. So now a few shout outs. So since we'll be doing everything online this quarter, because of the pandemic that's happening right now, I wanted to give a few shout outs to the programs we have already done and the programs that are coming up. So first, xenophobia within communities of color. Me and another intern named Giselle did that program over Zoom, I think it was 2 weeks ago. If you were not able to watch it or check it out live, it is on our YouTube page, along with mail art and social movements that was done by Giselle. It talks about what mail art is, how it was important in social movements, and also she gives a tutorial on how to create different types of mail art. And also the interns have started a podcast because we're trying to do things differently. We call it Cultivating Conversations. We've uploaded one so far. It's also on YouTube. It's about half an hour long. We'll be uploading a few more this quarter. So check it out. I think all of them are really great. Some upcoming ones include astrology and social justice. That will be happening tomorrow. That is going to be all these social justice educator interns working on that together. There's also going to be an anti-Blackness workshop that's week 6. And then the last 2 programs on here are special programs for interns. So part of our job, we have to put on one program per year that is, in a sense, is supposed to be a very large program that we create ourselves from the ground up. And so I had mine in fall where it was called Deconstructing the Way Black People View Mathematics. These 2 programs are just like that, except they're done by 2 different interns. So please check all these out. They'll be really fun, really cool. I've gotten to see most of these programs in the works and how they worked out, and I'm very excited for when they do happen, and I'll be one of the people watching. So a quick overview of what will be talked about. First, I'll be talking about the topic at large and what that even, I guess what the topic is actually going to be about, because I recognize that the title, Math as a Form of Social Justice, can be very misleading. So I'll talk about it a little bit more. Next, we'll be talking about the pre and post-emancipation. And before I go further, I just want to explain why I structured it this way. So I realized today I kind of structured this almost like a math proof. And before people log off, because I'm talking about math, just give me a second. What I mean is, if you're reading through a math book and they talk about a theorem, they'll explain, what the theorem is, that what it allows you to do and all that, and then they'll actually prove it. So this is basically me saying I believe that in this generation, mathematics can be used and should be used as a form of liberation and can be used in different social justice areas. And this is essentially going to be me proving it by looking at different eras throughout history and the different struggles that happened in those times and what was needed to come out of those struggles. So first we'll be talking about pre and post-emancipation, along with voting rights right afterwards, so the voting rights era. And this is all juxtaposed to the Black community. Next, we'll be talking about the desegregation of schools, what that meant, how that happened, how that tied into the civil rights movement, the civil rights era as a whole, and finally connecting it to mathematics, and then we'll come to some type of conclusion. The conclusion itself is not going to necessarily me saying, this is what we need to do to, progress this cause or anything like that. It's me, I guess, me talking. I don't know how to explain it. I'll explain it better when we get there, but this will be the outline more or less. And so let's get started. Oops, okay. So first, what this topic is about. I'm going to be juxtaposing math to radical social changes in the past. And the reason I'm doing this is because I feel like me saying math can be used in such a way is very odd, because people think of math as, engineering, computer science, you're tweaking and creating technology, and most people don't connect it to a social dynamic within our society. I'm also going to be talking about the shift of what is considered radical social change to help kind of prove my idea or make it seem more plausible. And we'll also be talking about the way in which mathematics aids social justice and what math means in our society. Okay, so I want to start by saying none of these topics that I'll be discussing, I'm going to be discussing in complete length, because each of these could be a whole class by themselves. But I still want to be able to touch on some things, and then hopefully we'll tie everything together by the end. And also, I apologize if at some point this seems really lectury. I didn't mean for it to be lectury, but as I was writing this or I was doing the program, I realized I was going to be talking a lot. Wasn't my intention, but I promise it will still be fun and interesting. So I wanted to talk about different slave rebellions starting off, because a lot of people, when they think about the era of slavery during this time, even though I feel like slave rebellions are talked about, they're mentioned, it's not as heavily as they should be. Because think about, when you really think about it, slavery started in America in 16, 19, and that in itself, I'm sure this says afterwards. I'm not sure if I will be able to. I can figure it out later on. We can come back to that. So slavery started in 1619, and this continued on well past the creation of America. Ironically, American settlers didn't realize the irony of having slaves while also feeling that they were slaves to Britain, but that's not really part of this topic, just kind of ironic. So a few slave rebellions that started. The first two are not as well known because they were not as quote unquote successful. So the first was led by Gabriel Prosser in 1800s, and the second was by Denmark Vesey in 1822. The one that is most well known more than any others is Nat Turner's in 1831. This is most well known because of the extent to which the rebellion went to and what was required to actually stop it. So I think it was roughly 70 Black men and women ended up killing 60 white men and women in this rebellion. And eventually, the only way that they were able to shut it down was with military force, which in itself was very remarkable if you're looking at it in a historical sense. And then eventually, all these different types of rebellions led to, well, the rebellions, along with a lot of other things that I'm not talking about here, led to the abolition movement. And there was a lot of different leaders in the abolition movement that aren't discussed throughout history. And the reason why this movement is so historically prominent, aside from, eventually ending slavery, was that when you think about the North versus the South, at this time, slavery was very prominent in the South, but not as prominent in the North. So, and I mean, slavery in the North was more so, it was about putting money into different slave plantations in the South for the most part, but there was not a whole lot of slavery going on in the North. So a lot of Northerners were very much in favor of the abolition movement, either one, because they did not want the South to have its economy growing the way it was, they believed it was a genuine sin, or they believed that slavery was an aggressive form of oppression. So there was a lot of different leaders. The most prominent and well-known is Frederick Douglass. I personally, looking at Frederick Douglass in that era is really amazing because this is an era where no Black individual was free. Most Black people were illiterate. They were not educated in the traditional sense. And he was the exact opposite of these things, which is why he stood out so much throughout history. And also Harriet Tubman, who's also well known and always well connected to the Underground Railroad. She was not the only person who was part of that Underground Railroad operation, just the one we know most about. And I wanted to talk briefly about medical atrocities because I feel like I wouldn't be able to talk about slavery if I didn't talk about some of the horrors of it, because it's historically important to always remember these things. So there's this individual named James Sims who has a statue, I think somewhere in New York City, I believe, or somewhere in the state of New York. He is known right now as the father of gynecology because of the different discoveries he was able to find for the field. One of them being the creation of the vaginal speculum. The problem was, though, he did all of these testings on enslaved women. And more in particular, he would do these testing on these women while they were alive because he needed to understand how these different surgeries or procedures were actually affecting their bodies. So even though, yes, what he did was great, it was also came with a lot of horrific stories and treatment. Okay. So I put a quote here from Frederick Douglass. He said, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." I think that's very important, and it ties in very well with what we'll be talking about today. In the next slide, there we go. So post-emancipation. And the reason why I say that that quote was so important is because throughout this era, illiteracy became a very large and very important issue that needed to be tackled. But we'll find that even when you are able to read, you're not necessarily free. But in his case, it actually was pretty true because if anyone has not read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, please do. It's an incredible book and it's really interesting just seeing how he learned how to read. I don't remember the exact details, but I know he learned to read from a white neighbor's child who would either read him the newspaper or bring him a newspaper and kind of taught him a little bit. And then eventually that led to him being able to run away from his slave master and have the life that he did. Sorry, tangent. Okay, so post-emancipation. I'm calling this setting the stage because in a lot of ways, this set the stage to where Black people are right now, because at this time, everyone was still enslaved. But after emancipation happened and people were freed, this is where we see genuine social progression. So I wanted to juxtapose the North to the South. As I've already stated, in the North, there was not slavery as we know it to be in the South. Obviously, Black people still had to deal with a lot of problems, one being illiteracy because discrimination is still very much real. The other, of course, being discrimination. and financial burdens as a whole, because when you're trying to live in a society that is so racist, you're always going to have different financial issues. And so juxtaposing that to the South, after everyone had been freed, Black people in the South are now facing the same challenges as those in the North, except that all of them have been freed at once. Usually if slaves are running away from the South to the North, then it's just them moving. So it does not affect the economy at large as a whole. But with everyone being free, the economy for the South changed drastically. So looking at the lives of freed slaves at that point, they have no means of self-preservation, education, or work, which historically is very important to understand because of what comes next. So really quick, I would like to ask you all, what do you think the number 4 million in this situation represents? I promise you do not need to overthink this. And you can put answers in the chat, and I should be able to respond to them. All right, so so the question I had asked was, what does the number 4 million, what do you feel like that number represents in this era? Okay, no guesses. That's oh wait, I closed the chat. I saw what the guess was though. Yes, that is right. So it was the number of those who were enslaved before the when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. So I want to talk really quickly about why this was a problem overall. So when the proclamation was originally signed, there was roughly 4 million who were enslaved, and then the 13th Amendment officially freed these slaves. Now, looking at it from the side of those who were enslaved, they're still dealing with a lot of racial inequality, and that would show through illiteracy and looking at the generational wealth and education and knowledge that they're lacking juxtaposed to white people in this country at the time. And that in itself created a problem for Black people, but there was also a larger problem, not I won't say larger, but there was also a problem in regards to society. I'll play this video.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McGree and they've been working him in prison for 12 months. I asked him to let me have him, but he won't let him go.
For a period of nearly 80 years between the Civil War and World War II, Black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free. In one of the most shameful and little-known chapters of American history, generations of Black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
From almost the first moment, white Southerners were responding to try to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The Old South and what was quickly becoming the New South could not proceed without the work of African Americans.
But if you had something for free in the past, you don't necessarily want to pay for it now.
It was a straight, simple, exploitative system. There was only power, there was only force, there was only brutality.
What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today. The depth of poverty, the inability of African Americans to access any of the mechanisms of wealth achievement and growth are all rooted in this terroristic kind of regime that existed in so many places.
Their ability to have what we call the American dream. That is what has been stolen from Black folks all through the South. And that legacy has to be understood so that people will be able to speak to it and give our ancestors voice.
Okay, so in case anyone was wondering what the video was talking about or what it was referring to, it was referring to sharecropping. So funny story, when I was, I think in fourth or fifth grade is when, that's the earliest time I remember learning about what sharecropping was. But the way it was spun in history books made it seem like it was actually a positive thing. And I actually looked up a video when I was trying to find something to display what sharecropping was. And the video itself also didn't even go into how it affected Black people, which I thought was really funny because even the video itself made it seem like, okay, slavery's done. We're doing this because it will better the economy and help Black people. Here we go. And that was so far from the truth. So looking at the position that white people were in at that time, you have Southerners who have lost their economy. Sorry, one second. So you have Southerners who have lost their economy because of the end of slavery and who want to stabilize their wealth. And as I stated, Black people at this time are just trying to exist at this point. And in my opinion, so ending slavery, what it was supposed to lead to was some type of racial equality or equity within America that we're still trying to work towards today. But Black people at this time can't even really consider working towards that when they're still trying to just survive. And this is where sharecropping came in, because white people would be able to offer a part of their land to different Black people as a place for them to stay. They can have their families there. And in return, they would essentially work the land that the white people had given them, and they would essentially share the crops from that land. So the problem was, though, is that the portion of the crops being shared itself was never a fair amount considering what was going on. And so this basically led to a lot of Black people still struggling to survive and live, but also not really having a choice but to do this. So it's still in a form of slavery. And white people having some type of, there is technically speaking a very, very small backlash or downside if you're looking at it from a financial sense of what they used to have to what they have now in this system. But in reality, there wasn't any problems for them. At most, it was just an inconvenience. So I want to stop here and ask, has anything stood out? Do you have any questions? I should also say, if you have any questions, you can ask them throughout the presentation. I'm more than happy to answer. And I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm just, if I can't answer, I will. And also it gives me a chance to drink water because I'll be talking for a long time. So I'll put 2 minutes on the clock. It's a timer. After that, we'll move on. All right, 2 minutes are up. If anything, it gave me a break from talking, so that's great. If you have any questions at all, again, feel free to ask it during anytime throughout this program. So another quote from Frederick Douglass: slavery is not abolished until Black individuals have the ballot, until the Black individual has the ballot. Again, I think it works really well with what I'm going to be talking about next, which is voting rights. But the reason I chose this one along with the last one is because the first quote gives this idea that once someone is has the power to educate themselves, they can free themselves. But that's also not entirely true. So this is another idea or notion of what can lead to freedom. And eventually, I wouldn't say that this leads to freedom either, but I think each one is a step closer, if that makes sense, or a step closer towards equality. So we're going to go over this, not fast, but again, it's not going to be all-encompassing by any means. So starting with the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people who were born and naturalized in the US, which is a really big deal because this meant that everyone who was previously a slave now is considered a citizen. However, this also means that they technically have voting rights, meaning that they're actually able to vote when it comes to different elections. And then the 15th Amendment was added, which denied any type of voting discrimination based on race or anyone who was previously a slave. So if someone were to be born after the 15th Amendment, then they still have voting rights and they cannot be discriminated against. But someone who was born before the 15th Amendment, this also still applies to them. However, discrimination, as we know, still existed, and it was actually more prevalent in a lot of ways because instead of focusing on race, they now focus on abilities such as reading, which is why things like illiteracy were so important at the time. So looking closer at the voting discrimination that happened, I'm saying discrimination because the way that it was spun at the time, it was not discrimination, but obviously it was. And well, okay, the first way this happened was through violence. The KKK was still very prominent at this time, so any Black person who attempted to vote or any Black person who tried to register people to vote or was trying to push for Black people to vote in any way, shape, or form was met with violence. And there's someone I'm going to be talking about later. His name is Robert Moses, but I'm going to reference him a few times before I introduce him. Robert Moses was alive during this era, and he was actually very prominent in trying to get people to register. There was an altercation he had with a white person who saw what he was doing. The white person ended up confronting him along with several friends, and they ended up beating him. I know he needed medical attention along with stitches afterwards. So this wasn't something that was just kind of like, okay, you're getting bullied for it. People were brutally, brutally beaten for trying to do something like this. And there's also voter restriction. This came in the form of an annual poll tax along with literacy tests. So there were different government officials who met together for the sole purpose of trying to keep Black people out of voting. And there was several things that they came up with, and these were two of them. One, the annual poll tax, which if you're someone who's white in this country, it's more of a nuisance than something that's going to stop you from voting because you're coming from a position where you can have generational wealth. But Black people at this time who maybe aren't even one generation removed from slavery or not even two generations, there is no generational wealth to be had of any means. So this annual poll tax was actually very significant. And also the literacy test. I remember I want to say I was in high school when I first I actually really got to see and take a literacy test that was offered to people at that time. And I remember I was in a full class of people. We all took it, and there was one question in particular that we all agreed what the right answer was. It was very obvious what the right answer was. However, when our teacher had presented the answer to us, none of us were right. And I don't remember what the question was, but it was simple enough that we knew what the real answer was supposed to be. Everyone agreed on it. The teacher agreed on it, but that was not the answer. That was not the legal answer. So the test itself, a lot of times, was made so that no one could really pass it. And also part of the test was you had to read part of the Constitution to a polling clerk who was present, and basically you needed to not recite it, but you needed to rephrase what the passage said. Now, this could be really easy or really hard depending on what part of the Constitution you are given. If you're asked to explain what the phrase "we the people" means versus explain the entirety of the preamble, those are two different things of varying difficulties. It also didn't help, as I said, that a lot of Black people were illiterate. Even those who were literate, if they were able to read it and understand it, you still needed to get the approval of the person who was in charge there. And very often, I think, actually, no, this person was exclusively white, and this was always someone who did not want you to vote. So the entire literacy test was rigged, so that way you would not be able to pass it, even if you are literate. And lastly, the grandfather clause, because with all these different restrictions happening, it's likely that many white people will not be able to vote. So the grandfather clause says that if your grandfather was qualified before the Civil War to vote, then you qualify as well. Now, this worked well for white people because white people in America have had the vote. So it was more likely than not that their grandfather was actually able to vote before the Civil War. However, the Civil War was a key factor in emancipation, which means before the Civil War, there was not a single Black person who was able to vote. So the grandfather clause did not apply to Black people at all. How am I doing on time? Okay. So next, talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And again, just so we're on the same page, I am going to juxtapose this later on to mathematics, but I think the best way of doing that is getting a grasp understanding of how important illiteracy was throughout history and also the voting right along with schooling. So just kind of to refocus on what it is. I know it kind of seems like I'm going on multiple tangents. So looking at the Voting Rights Act, in 1940, there was only 3% of Black men and women who were registered to vote, which itself is outrageously low. But again, there was action that was taken to try to raise that number. I already gave you one example of Robert Moses, and this was always met with violence and uproar. The problem is, though, if people do not have voting power, that means they have no power in our society, which is why even in this generation, we always try to tell people to get out and vote when that time comes, because that is your voice. However, at this time, Black people were not being able to even have a voice. So eventually, the development of the civil rights movement started in the 1950s. We know the 1960s as being the civil rights era, but the movement started in the 1950s with Brown versus Board, which I'll talk about later. And also the Freedom Riders were also established in the early 1960s. Anyone who doesn't know who the Freedom Riders were, they were essentially different individuals who would ride the interstate bus into segregated parts of the United States as a form of rebellion. So eventually, with these two things, along with a lot of other different factors that I'm not mentioning right now, eventually 43% of Black people were able to register in the South by 1960. Now, admittedly, it did take 24 years for it to raise this much, but still going from 3% to 43% is a very large jump, especially in political power. And so with time, also that year, the 24th Amendment outlawed polling taxes, which allowed for more Black people to be able to vote, which may also have encouraged more Black people to register to vote. And finally, in March 7th, 1965, the protest march from Selma to Montgomery. I'm not talking about this march that much because I feel like it's talked about enough throughout history that it's very easy to look up. And also, if anyone has not seen the movie Selma, I'm not saying that the movie itself is a perfect depiction of what happened, but I think in a lot of ways it lets you know what was at risk for people. Because again, it wasn't just that you were being bullied for your ideals. Many people were, obviously people were yelled at, screamed at, they were chased, followed, they were beaten. A lot of people were killed for this march, but eventually it led to the Voting Rights Act. And this is a quote from the then president at the time. It says, "It is not just Black people, it is all of us." And I'm paraphrasing, I'm only keep taking the beginning of the quote. And basically what the statement meant was, it's not just Black people who are in a position where they need to move up in society because of what happened during the slave era. It's basically saying that slavery at the time affected all of us in some way, shape, or form, and we all need to heal from it. I basically kind of take it as this was a very nice and charming statement to kind of slap on to what needed to be done already. And now the desegregation of schools. So Brown versus Board of Education. This was a much more prominent court case than I feel like a lot of people give it credit for, because if you really look at different things that were talked about that were happening in the civil rights era, everything was juxtaposed to segregation. And looking at the time frame of everything, you'll realize that basically everything's, well, not everything, I want to say everything so liberally, but a lot of things started with Brown versus Board. So the decision for Brown versus Board, it was decided in 1955 by the Supreme Court that segregation in schools is unconstitutional. However, nothing was really done about it. It was just kind of stated. So it was readdressed 1 year later, and the court left the desegregation in the hands of local schools, local communities, and local governments. The problem with this, though, is that it was local schools and communities that did not want desegregation at all. They wanted things to stay segregated. So for almost 10 years, nothing really changed, which is when you had different freedom riders. You had a lot of other things that were coming up, and this is when the progression of the civil rights era actually started. Along with that, you have the I Have a Dream speech, which happened in August 28, 1963. If you notice the dates, this provision for the Civil Rights Act happened in 1964. So these provisions allowed for the federal government, to enforce school segregation in two ways. One, they were allowed to sue different schools that were still segregated, and also it allowed for them to defund schools that were still segregated. And because the world revolves around money, this did the trick. So I want to talk about the I Have a Dream speech just a little bit. I want to start off by saying, if you have not looked up the different works and the speeches of Martin Luther King in the few years before he died, not necessarily this speech or before, but the last 2 or 3 years, I highly advise you to, because it's not talked about throughout in history or in history classes. But the speech itself was focused on this desegregation of society and of American hearts, with one of the lines being, little Black boys and little Black girls will join hands with little white boys and little white girls. So, okay, up until this point, does anyone have any questions about the stage that has been set? It doesn't necessarily need to be about anything I've discussed. It could be slightly off topic. I'm going to set a timer for about 2 minutes. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If not, it's okay. All right, so we're gonna keep going. Okay, so as I promised, we're finally going to be connecting all of this to mathematics and trying to bridge this idea, or the ideas between mathematics and all these different things we've been discussing so far. First, we'll be talking about the importance of mathematics. Why is it necessary to be mathematically literate in this time? After that, we'll be talking about math in the Black community and where Black people stand in mathematical performance. After that, we'll be talking about math outside of the field and where math can help. What I mean by these two things are, is math useful outside of, say, getting a mathematics degree like me, or where can math start to help or benefit people? So first off, I want to ask you all, why should people care about mathematics? Or if you feel like people shouldn't care, you can also say that. You can put your answers into the chat, and hopefully we can have something of a dialogue or discussion. I guess I can also start by saying, I believe it is important for people to learn math because like a lot of different things in our society, math is constantly around us. We just don't really notice it or realize it. And a lot of the skills that you can learn in mathematics can be applied in a broader sense. That's my short answer. I would like to hear from you all about what your answer to this would be. Math r/can facts. Math is used as a proxy for intelligence, is considered a gatekeeper for higher paying jobs. That is true. I'm going to talk about, it's ironic that you bring up gatekeeping. That's also mentioned later on. But yeah, mathematics so often in our society is viewed as this way to see someone's intelligence, which is, it doesn't do anyone any good, because you have the people who are deemed as unintelligent because they are not good at math. You have the people who are deemed as intelligent because they can do math. These people over here, they are looked down upon for a lot of different reasons, because they're not good at math. They're kind of not taken seriously. These people are praised to the point where they have large egos, and then, well, it gets really complicated. It's a language. Languages help us see the world in different ways, and I think that's important. That's something valuable and contributes to the development of individual. Oh, okay. Oh, this is great. Yeah. Math in itself is a language, because mathematics is essentially a system of symbols, and understanding what those symbols mean juxtaposed to each other, that is a language in itself. If math were made more equitable, there would be more opportunities in math learning. The National Council of Teachers in Mathematics say math education is key to help students, 1, expand professional opportunities, 2, understand the critique of the world, 3, experience beauty, joy, and wonder. However, too few students are actually experiencing these benefits, and marginalized students are often excluded. Very, very, very true. So the reason I want to go into math education is for these very reasons. I feel like how do I put this? I don't think, in my own opinion, that expecting people to look at math as a whole and experience joy is fair, because math, when you go really deep, at least the level that these people are talking about, it gets to a point where, unless you're like you really love math, or you really like the idea, the concept of mathematics, you're not going to fall in this category. So then, because a lot of these classes are focused on those people, you're not being benefited. Public policy is driven by statistics, risk, benefits, almost all of which are based on mathematical processing of data. That is true. Art, science, and everything in between involves mathematics. Okay. Whew. Thank you again for the level of participation. Yeah, I agree with everything you all are saying as to why mathematics is important, why people should care about it. And I also want to present these different ways of looking at it. So by no means do I feel like this is, again, all-encompassing. This is just what I can do within this time frame. So if we look at the life of a college student, mathematics is very prevalent in a lot of different fields of study, whether it's chemistry, or basically any STEM field whatsoever. along with a lot of social science fields. If we look at computer programming skills are becoming universal in a lot of fields of research. Recently, I've been talking to a lot of different students who we'll complain about coding together because I had to do a few coding classes, and coding itself, even though I do think it's kind of fun, it's also really annoying. And they said that for their major, they actually had to take a lot of coding classes. And the reason is because within their major, once you go to like the research side of things, you actually use coding systems to keep track of data and statistics. It also opens up paths to financial gain because no matter what you're going into, whatever field you're going into, if you're able to show that you have proficiency in some type of sub-branch of mathematics, that in itself looks really good. The same way that if you walk into an interview and you say, hey, I'm proficient in Java or CS, not CS, what am I thinking of? Java or Python or C++, that works really well towards getting you a job. And looking at the life of an adult, so looking at math as it is presented to the real world, not just the college world, obviously one, balancing a checkbook, that's always something very important to be able to do. Also starting a business. And I want to say, when I'm talking about these different examples, I'm not talking about collegiate level mathematics and why that's important. I'm not saying that it's important for everyone to get an A+ in calculus. I'm saying that math and understanding the principles of math, and I don't mean, this is really hard to explain because I don't necessarily mean like the different laws of addition and subtraction and all that, but being able to use the skills that math gives you, that's important. So obviously one, starting a business, because if you're not able to work with numbers or money, then starting a business itself is very hard. Grocery shopping is a very simple one. I know when I used to shop with my grandma, when I was not old enough, she would always look back at receipts to make sure everything added up, or if something started to look weird or funny, or a price didn't look right as people were scanning her groceries, she would always look back to see, okay, this is supposed to be on sale, this was on sale, this wasn't on sale, and make sure everything worked out. And also, ironically, planning an event is also really helpful too. And the reason is because mathematics, as I stated before, is a system of symbols. And all of math it's about utilizing and understanding the symbols in front of you along with the tools you have. So if I give you an equation, I promise it won't, okay, no one forget, it's not difficult, I promise. It's not calculus. If I tell you x plus y equals 2, and I also tell you x equals y, then if you write it out and you look at it, you can see, okay, then y and x both equal 1. If I tell you x plus y equals 1, but x has to be a natural number and it can't be 0, you can figure out x equals 1. And that's all math is. Even when you go to higher levels of it and you're talking about, probability, statistics, computational mathematics, abstract, theoretical, it's especially theoretical actually. It's all about understanding what your end goal needs to be, or knowing what result you want, looking at what you have and the tools that you have. And that is exactly what planning different events is, or even if you're planning how you want to organize a room or your apartment, anything of that nature, is understanding the space you're in, different things in that room, the different space they take up, and how you can creatively place things in whatever way works best. And the biggest difference I would say between math and say planning an event is that a lot of times for math, there's only one right answer. There might be a lot of ways to get there, but very often there's only a right answer, or there's a solution at the end that you need to try to find. With planning an event, you're not looking for a single right answer, you're looking for the best possible outcome. But a lot of times that also leads to being one best outcome, if that makes sense. And lastly, of course, path for financial gain. So again, quote from Robert Moses. I haven't introduced him yet, but I promise I will. He said this in 2001. Right now, the Department of Labor says 70% of all jobs require technology literacy. By the year 2010, all jobs will require significant technical skills. So right now we are in the year 2020. And I would say basically every job requires you to have some level of technological understanding. And this is not me saying that you need to be able to, again, I'm not saying you need to be able to do calculus to be a clerk at a grocery store or anything like that. But the reason I put this quote here is because with time, we start to understand that literacy in mathematics is becoming something similar to what, say, literacy with reading and writing was in the 1800s. So these are the breakdown of scores in 2018 of SAT scores of high school students. So as you can see, just looking at the results of Black students and looking at mathematics, obviously, okay, so the SAT is not a good idea or standard of what education or intelligence is, because education can vary based on your location, your school, your teachers, and all of that. But there's some small level of validity here, and that's why I'm really going off of with this. Looking at these scores, Black people still score the lowest. However, we understand at this point that understanding mathematics is also very, very key to being successful in society. And I also still wanted to talk about that a little more. So math versus illiteracy / voting / schooling. So if you notice on both sides, we see exactly the same. But I'm going to break down everything to try and prove this point a little more. So looking at the right side. So if we're talking about illiteracy, voting, and schooling, all of these have been viewed as gatekeepers of our society at large. In the 1800s, if you were not able to read or write, there was a lot going on in society that you just couldn't interact with, which means you were not getting information the same way other people were. You were not able to contribute in society the same way other people were, and you weren't even seen as equal. Looking at voting, because we've established at this point that voting in itself is power in a society, not being able to vote in that society basically means that your opinion in society or that society doesn't matter, or it's being belittled. So you're basically being kept out of the greater portion of society where just slow down, where you're being kept out of part of society where you're able to exert more power of what you want, actually getting your needs met. And also schooling, this one is not necessarily viewed the same as the other two, but the problem with the segregated schools was that the Black schools had much worse supplies and funding compared to white schools. And that's where this gatekeeper mentality comes in, because depending on what school you're coming from, you're able to access different parts of society or you're not able to. It's kind of the same, it's not. But if I were to say, hey, I graduated from San Diego State versus someone saying, hey, I graduated from Harvard, both are recognized as universities, but Harvard has more prestige there. The same thing is kind of similar here, except for there's an obvious level of inequality that was not being addressed. All three garner levels of respect in society. So you're able to read or you have the vote. Actually, I would say it's less that you garner respect and more so that you're not disrespected. So there's a lack of disrespect because you're able to do these things and people can view you as quote unquote normal. And then if you are illiterate or you're not able to vote, then you were immediately othered because of that. Or if the level of schooling you had was not on the same level as others. It was also necessary to participate within society on a meaningful level. That's also very true. They were also very hard to come by. Looking at it from the view of Black people in the 1800s, it was very hard to be literate because, one, while slavery was still happening, no slave master was going to teach their slave how to read or write, because that in itself was power. And even after slavery had ended, no white person was going to keenly teach someone Black how to read or write for the same reasons. Along with voting, I already explained this in the presentation, but it took a lot of energy and a lot of lives were lost in the process of trying to get the vote for Black people. Along with this desegregation of schools and trying to get to the point of equal schooling, which, we still haven't reached, but that's another topic entirely. It can also heavily improve the functionality in society. Your observations, remath, and thank you very much. Honestly, I was kind of happy with this slide. I'm not gonna lie. But anyways, also can heavily improve the functionality in society. Also very true. Looking at it from the math side, can be viewed as a type of gatekeeper society in mathematics. So I still haven't introduced them yet. Okay, so this is a book I have here. It's called Radical Equations, and the author is Robert Moses. Well, there we go, Robert Moses. And one of the things he states in the book is how this isn't necessarily true anymore because of Common Core, but algebra itself was a gatekeeper in our society because to graduate high school, you needed to have passed algebra. To get into college, you also need to go past algebra unless you're going to a community college. But if you go to a community college and you're not doing at least algebra level mathematics, that could extend your stay. I'm saying this from experience because I tutored a lot of people who were in math, or I also knew people who were taking a lot of math courses at my time at community college. That can extend your stay by up to, I want to say, 2 years. I actually met someone who had been in community college at that time, I think for 3 years total. They were just entering Algebra 2, and they came in, I think, the lowest level mathematics, and they were trying to go for a bachelor's degree in mathematics. So it was a lot they still had to go through. So algebra in itself is a lot. I think what you're saying really still is true under Common Core. It's just that the course isn't called. Yeah. Common Core, that's a really good point. So I shouldn't say that it's not true anymore. It's more so that it's not just the class of algebra is the gatekeeper, but now it's a class within Common Core. Thank you for that. Also garners a certain level of respect. I'm saying this from experience because when I tell people I'm a math major and they expect me to be able to do all these absurd different things with numbers and all that, there is immediate level of respect given to me, and I'm not going to talk about it, but there's a certain level of respect that's given to anyone who's able to do math, and also a certain lack of respect that's given to people who are bad at math. And maybe lack of respect isn't the right term, but there's a difference in the way people will address you or talk to you. It's also necessary to participate within society on a meaningful level. I say this very loosely because obviously you can still have societal impact with the way things are now and the growth of technology and social media. But if you want to be able to live on your own and to function within the society by yourself, you still need to have some level of understanding of mathematics. Even something as simple as knowing how much money you're able to spend so you still have money to pay rent. Even something like that. Something very simple like that, that still requires an understanding of numbers. It's also hard to come by. I make this argument not in the same sense that I made the other one where people are fighting to stop you from learning it. I make this argument in regards to Black students because very often the way Black students are taught mathematics is not the best way because they're always being placed against other racial groups. But the way they're being placed against other racial groups puts them already at a disadvantage because many people do not believe that they're able to perform mathematics. Therefore, if they're not taken seriously, they're not taught the same level of material, they're not given the same type of care in regards to their education. So if you have two students, both given equal opportunity, both given equal chances to succeed, but this teacher believes in this student, this teacher does not believe in this student, then it's going to show in their performance. Also can heavily improve your functionality in society. That relates closely to the one that's two above it. So again, if anyone has any questions, you can, oh, well, there is a question, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna come back to it. For some reason I'm not able to open it. Yes, I am recording the webinar. This will be going on UCSD Cross-Cultural Center's YouTube page. Okay. So I want to put a quick spotlight on a past intern that I got the privilege of meeting, I think it was in February. His name is Eugene. He teaches at community college right now, and he teaches different computer science courses. And the reason I wanted to talk about him is because when I was talking to him about his teaching and his method of teaching, I was really surprised at how he says he teaches, because a lot of times with mathematics or computer science classes, the teachers will focus on homework more than anything else. And okay, on a personal level, I don't feel like it's always the best way to go about it. And what Eugene does is he focuses all his classes around projects. And to give an example from my own life and an own course I was in last quarter. To sign off. I completely understand. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, it will be on YouTube, so you can watch the rest. Thank you for also saying you have to leave. I appreciate that very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Please stay safe and healthy. So Eugene said that goes about his courses with projects, and something I went through that was kind of similar was last quarter for my CS class. We essentially create a very, very, very bare bone Pokemon game where each file was like a different Pokemon we'd be able to create. Pokemons had levels and attacks and all that, or attack damage. Some Pokemon's attack damage was consistent, others would be random, it would vary. So something similar to that, where he would figure out what students were interested in or what they liked, even if it was something complex, say something like Twitter, or if it was something simple, and he would say, okay, you're able to make that through coding, here's how you can do it. And I'm not saying that he helped students make a new Twitter, but it was something along those lines where he would find an interest in what they actually like, and that would become a project. And I know in my experience thus far, I've had the most fun learning, regardless of what the course was, when I was truly intrigued and interested in whatever was being discussed or talked about. So that's why I wanted to highlight what he had done. Okay, so next we're going to talk about Robert Moses. Robert Moses, he's still alive to this day. He is the founder of the Algebra Project, which we'll be talking about a little bit in a second. He's the person I had mentioned before who was very adamantly trying to get Black people to register to vote. Well, yeah, I guess I can just go to the next slide and explain more. So biggest reason why I wanted to bring him up is because of his Algebra Project. So the Algebra Project, as you'll see here, it uses mathematics literacy as an organizing tool to guarantee quality public school education for all children in the US. So in other words, he's using this focus of mathematics to help make sure people are able to have a quality and good education. So at first it started out as him tutoring his oldest daughter. So he had been a teacher in Tanzania for I think 2 years, him and his wife. And eventually, once they had settled down back in America, they started sending their children to a school on the East Coast that was near them. I think it was called MLK Charter School or MLK School, something like that. And he would actually teach his daughter mathematics at home, because he, at that time, still believed that math was the key to bettering someone's future in society. So he would do this throughout her years in school. And eventually, when she got to 8th grade, there was other students in her 8th grade class who wanted to learn, I think it was at the time, it was algebra that he was going to be teaching her. So he was then invited to actually teach a course on campus as a parent teacher. And that's how the Algebra Project started. It was him teaching algebra to his daughter at the time and also a few other of her classmates. And eventually this turned from a class to a whole project and organization that's still thriving to this day. So as I said before, he viewed algebra in particular as a threshold. Something he said is, so algebra once solely in place as a gatekeeper for higher math and priesthood, and the priesthood who gained access to it now is a gatekeeper for citizenship. So what he means by that is, very often, if you're just looking at someone who wants to be a math major or who wants to be a professor in abstract mathematics, at some point in time, algebra was kind of that gatekeeper of that higher level of mathematics. But within our society now, it's gotten to the point where if you have not been able to pass that algebra level mathematics, then even though you're still considered a citizen, there's so many different things that you do not have access to, or you won't be considered for because of that. He says that now, in this day and age, we're not able to brush off. So I should state, this book was published in 2001. He stated that we're not able to brush off, as people did in the past, learning mathematics simply because it is hard, or we view it as being hard. Because in the past, mathematics was not something that was like on the forefront of what needed to be done to further people in society. But at this point, it's now getting to that. It's not getting there, we're there now. So it's also, something that's also really interesting is that this is not necessarily true throughout all societies. This is particularly true in America. So if you go to certain European countries, then in those countries, this is what geometry would be considered. And it all depends on what that threshold class is. And even I just said recently, it's no longer necessarily class of algebra, it's whatever Common Core equivalent that would be. So the importance of teaching the youth, I'm going to read a quote from Robert Moses' daughter. That's actually in his book. She talks about her experience with her dad and him teaching her. It's also a long quote, so bear with me. I suppose in a way the Algebra Project starts with me. I'm the oldest of 4 children in our family, and even before we started school, we all grew up doing math, me first. My mom would do reading with us, and my father, he would do the math. I could not have been 5 yet, but I remember my dad had this felt board, and he used to have to arrange things on this board, and it wasn't playing games. It was math, even though I don't remember exactly what it was. I liked it when I was young, but then when I got older, I didn't like it. It was like I was always doing it after school on weekends. We went to Denver, Colorado to visit the Hardings and lugged the math books out there. I started to resent it because I had to do it and keep doing it. The sessions were kind of hard because my dad would ask me questions and I wouldn't answer, or I would have an attitude and my voice would give the answer. Interestingly, although I didn't like doing the math at home, I always liked the math in school, and it's because of the work we did at home that I never had a problem with the math we did in school. And I liked, even though obviously, I mean, she definitely didn't like it all the time. I wanted to read that out because it shows that starting math at a younger age can set a very strong foundation. I also wanted to share a personal story for why I really like math and why I think it's important to make an impression at a young age. So when I was younger, before my grandma passed away, me and my mom were living with her. And when my mom was at work, I would stay at home with my grandma, and she used to have these numbered cards 1 to 50. And then on the back of each of those was 51 to 100. So on the back of 1 was 51, on the back of 2 is 52, and so on and so forth. And every single day, she would make me flip these cards over 5 to 10 times and read each number aloud. And when she first had me do this, I was genuinely learning, but eventually I got really bored of it and annoyed with it. And I used to always wonder why she had me do this, but I continued to do it because I loved my grandma. So now for me, mathematics is very tied to that love I had for her and that appreciation that she did that for me at that time. So now that kind of stuck with me throughout my education, which is why I'd always really, really enjoyed math, because even though there was definitely times where it annoyed me doing that at home, by the time I got to school and we started doing different things with numbers, it wasn't anything that was challenging for me because I was constantly working with numbers at home already. So it just felt like more of the old, and I was able to harness things better. Eventually that led to a stronger foundation, which allowed me to learn further later on. And so focusing on the foundation that I just said, mathematics to me is very often, I view it like a house. Every part of mathematics, however vast the subject may be, is important. So some parts are very unique. Some parts have key functions. There's other parts that are not unique necessarily. They're very similar to other parts, but they're still important in and of themselves. But the key to everything is that foundation. If I wanted to teach everyone in this webinar how to do calculus, I wouldn't be able to do that unless I knew that all of you understood, say, algebra, or before even algebra, that you all understood arithmetics, or that you understood the number line. We always have to start somewhere. And so long as that foundation continues to be strong, we can always build on that. And so this statement here, I put to remind myself to talk about it because I think it's when I first heard it, I honestly was I was kind of shocked. But if anyone knows who Wayne is, I was talking to him, well, it was the very first few times I was talking to him, and he was talking to me about Robert Moses. And he said that he got to hear him speak once, and that Robert Moses had stated that, thank you, he had stated that there is nothing radical about voting. And when I first heard this, I kind of laughed because I thought to myself, how on earth is there nothing radical about voting? Where we always preach to people that you need to vote. He said that what is radical is helping someone who is poor or is viewed in society as less get the vote is radical. He also said that there is nothing radical about teaching mathematics. But what is radical is teaching mathematics to a young Black child. The reason why both of these are radical is because, well, the reason why voting is not radical and the reason why teaching math is not radical is because you're not going against the system. You're not going against the system of oppression that's already been in place to hold people down. But by getting someone who is poor or someone who is seen as lesser the vote, or by teaching a young Black child mathematics, you're going against the system of oppression that's been placed before that person. And that's the key to this whole presentation, in my opinion. Each of these things that we talked about thus far, whether it was, I didn't actually talk about the change of literacy because that'd be really hard to, I thought it was going to be very hard to put into a timeline, but illiteracy, voting, schooling, all of these things were viewed as radical at the time because they were going against what was considered the norm that was still holding people down, that was oppressing people. By that same logic, being able to teach Black children mathematics is, by the same token, also radical. So then we could still ask though, but why mathematics? Why is mathematics that radical thing that needs to be taught? I came up with like 10 different answers for this. And none of them I feel like are very concrete, which is why I wanted to make this program. But one of them, depending on how you view things in the world, I heard before in a philosophy class that philosophers in the past believed that mathematics was our way of understanding the language of God. So if that were to be true, then being able to teach someone mathematics is essentially allowing them to be able to reach that level of communication if we're following that logic. There's a lot of different answers for it. I'm not here to give you an answer necessarily. I'm here to explain to you why I believe it is mathematics. And I don't feel like there's really ever a concise answer for this, but I do believe that there is proof for why it should be math. So at this point, if you have any questions, comments, anything like that, feel free to put them in the chat. Some reason I'm still not able to click on the Q&A, so whoever asked the question, I'm very sorry. Or if you want to, you can put it in the chat and I'll answer it as well. This is my resource slides if you want to take a photo to see how I got all the information for this. And lastly, thank you very much. This is the QR code for the survey, or this is also the website for the survey of the presentation. Let me know how it went. Please leave a comment. We actually, when we give these presentations, we really do look back at the surveys to see how it went, what we can improve on. So please fill it out. I promise I'm going to read it. I promise I'll read the comments and I'll see how I can do things better, or if things need to be different, or if you liked this, or if you didn't necessarily like this, please let me know. And thank you very much for coming. I'm going to stay on for a little bit to answer any questions that anyone may have, or read comments, anything. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll be staying on for a little bit to answer any questions anyone may have. So yeah, thank you again for coming. If you want to rewatch this, you can on the Cross-Cultural Center's YouTube page. It should be posted. I'm not gonna give a timeline for when it'll be posted because I don't know off the top of my head, but it will be posted relatively soon. And thank you everyone for coming. Okay, the video should be posted Friday. Stop screen sharing. I will make sure to put, actually I can just keep screen sharing, never mind. All right, seems like everyone's gone for the most part. There's 2 people left. I'm going to end it here. Again, thank you for coming. I really hope you enjoyed everything, and we'll have a good rest of your day. And I really hope you're able to stay safe and healthy during this quarantine. And please come to more Cross-Cultural Center events. If you want to know more about them, you can always sign up for the newsletter. You stop recording.